Now, what kind of a woman can God use? Well, that's verse 9. And Paul continues. He's writing to Timothy the specifics for the largest collection of godly women ever assembled in the first century. Can you imagine being over the largest women's ministry in the history of the church? And to do that, timid Timothy needed some help. And this is what Paul said. He says, here's what the nurturing women, the godly wives, and the godly moms were to look and act like. Now that's the context of this next set of verses. A lot of times it's only hauled out at certain times, but it's actually the environment to which nurturing discipleship takes place. And think about that. Number one, it says in verse 9, in like manner also. First of all, these women were to be unhindered in their worship of God. What is the in like manner also? It's pointing back to the verse 8. And it's talking about just like the men are to be these men of worship-filled prayer that fills their life, so are you. So you should be praying everywhere. And so you should be characterized by this faith and this patience and this trusting the Lord. So Paul lays all the men stuff on the women, and then he adds to it. In like manner also, that the women, and here are the unique characteristics for the women. Not only are they to have this unhindered overflow of worship like the men, but they are to have what Paul describes as a chosen life of modesty. Look what he says, that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel. The usage of the Greek verb for adorn speaks of their chosen wrappings. It's almost like, if you're gift wrapping yourself, what kind of wrapping are you going to put on? What is your chosen wrap that you're putting on? And he said this, that your chosen wrap be modest wrap. Now, it's not just clothes. It's an entire way of life. And what's interesting, the Greek word translated modestly, that the women adorn themselves in modest or modestly, in modest apparel, or some translations say modestly, right there in verse 9, speaks of modesty being mixed with humility. So it's kind of a compound word, modest humility. But at its core, commentators and philologists and word study people say this, it connotes a sense of shame. You might have, you ever read Old King James where it talks about shamefaced sobriety? That's kind of archaic, and it's kind of like we don't even know how to process that. It's the same word, shame. But it's not a shame in any way for being a woman. It's a shame for in any way inciting lust or distracting others from a proper worship of God. What Paul says is, women of Ephesus, you can, by your lifestyle and your dress, either incite lust or distract worship, or you can choose not to. Now, you don't have to say, well, they shouldn't pay attention to me and they shouldn't lust. They're wicked. Paul doesn't lay it on the men. He lays it on the women. And he says, for you to have a life that is powerful for God, don't in any way incite lust or distract from worship. A godly woman, Paul says, will do all she can to avoid being a source of temptation. The word also has a connotation of rejecting anything that dishonors God. See, clothing is not primarily designed for people. Who designed clothes, by the way? Who invented clothing in Genesis 3? God did. And God made clothing, it says in Genesis 3, I ought to read a theology of clothing. God made clothing as primarily a covering because of the fall of mankind into sin. So the primary purpose of clothing is not a statement or a fashion, but a covering because of sin in the world. And so women realize that. And they would grieve over ever causing anyone to sin because of their clothing. So a godly woman hates sin so much she will avoid anything that can produce sin in others. So she has a chosen modesty. So young ladies should see their mothers as modest. And if they want to do something, they can just pull out the dictionary. You know what? This is one time that the English language is still right on target. If you look up the Greek word modest and you look up the English word modest and you read the definitions, they're the same. Amazing. Must be part of our former Christian heritage. Here's what the English dictionary describes. If you look up the English word modest, this is what it says. Having regard for decency in behavior and dress, quiet and humble in appearance and style, not displaying your body, not boastful or vain, unassuming, virtuous, shy or reserved, chaste. You know what God says? Pursue that attitude, that lifestyle, and that wardrobe that displays not your body, but the modesty God has called you to do. And it's increasingly hard in our culture. It really is. I listened to Bonnie, and she says, I have to go to 10 stores to find clothes for our little girls that look like little girls. Because the world doesn't want them to look like little girls. They want them to all look like, they're something else in our culture. Number 3, look at the next part of this passage. Women are to have evident restraint. He says, with modesty, with propriety and moderation, he continues to say, not with... Now, wait a minute. We're not reading Leviticus here, by the way. We're not reading Numbers. We're not reading Exodus. We're not reading the Old Testament. We're right in the middle of a New Testament church with a New Testament pastor, with the man who wrote Galatians and says there shouldn't be any laws and there shouldn't be any law keeping and there shouldn't be any of that commandments on the wall that you try and measure up to with all your strength stuff. And why does he say these next words? Have you ever thought about that? Not with braided hair. I mean, everybody's supposed to just be flying in the wind. No gold or pearls. We're supposed to all be, kind of like the societies that don't allow any jewelry. And no costly clothing. We're all supposed to wear gunny sacks. I mean, what's the thing here? No, that's part of, remember, the first law of interpretation is this was written to someone, a specific, it wasn't written to the air. It wasn't read over the radio. It was written to a group of people. And in the first century, the Roman culture had come to the place of flaunting. And we don't need to go into all the details, but I already told you that they did their gymnastics with no clothes on. That's how the Olympics were. All those statues, the stamps, every time we have Olympics, shows all those Greek discus throwers. You notice they're not wearing any clothes. They didn't think that up at the UN Committee of Olympics. That's just how they did it. So if you can think they did sports with nothing on, you can imagine what they did dating and fashion and entertainment in. And so Paul says, don't let the culture squeeze you in. Be modest. And also have restraint, propriety and moderation. Don't have braided hair with gold and pearls. What is that? Well, the Roman emperor's wife started running threads of gold strung with pearls through her hair, and a typical hairdo cost around $75,000 back then. I mean, you thought, 50 at the hairdo place was bad. How would you like to pay $75,000? And then, that wasn't enough. They started weaving this stuff through their clothes. Gold threads with jewels on them. And so these people who were keeping up with the emperor's wife would come to church, and they would sit down at church with a $75,000 hairdo and with a $150,000 dress on next to someone that didn't know where they were going to get their next meal. And the person couldn't listen to the Bible. They were counting the pearls. And see, that whole concept, the people in Ephesus had just kind of been flowing with the culture, and they didn't realize how it had squeezed them into a way that was dishonoring the Lord. So Paul had to point out something in the culture that they were not to do because it displeased the Lord. And he calls us to do that the same. We should regularly not lay rules on people, but point out things in the culture that don't please God. So that's what he does. And what he says is, young ladies should see their mothers as proper and discreet, showing judgment and prudent and cautious, with this propriety, with this moderation, with this restraint. And finally, look at the end. He says, but, not all this, immodest stuff or this ostentatious dress, but, look at the end of verse 10, what is proper for women professing godliness with good works. When you see that woman, you shouldn't think about, whoa, look at her body, look at her figure, look at her expensive outfit, her $75,000 hairdo. No. Look what it says that should be the first thing that draws your attention. what is proper for a woman professing godliness? Her good works. Did you know people should quickly forget what you look like? Boy, that goes countercultural. We're supposed to make a statement. We're supposed to be provocative, evocative. We're supposed to cause people to just not be able to forget us. God says, they should be able to forget what you look like. They shouldn't be able to forget that you are, look at the end of verse 10, you are clothed with good works. You're surrounded by doing what pleases God. That's what you women were designed to be. By God, to be a woman who has this worship in like manner, this modesty, this restraint, and this overt godliness. In our culture, God desires women to have good works that are often looked upon as the exact opposite of what young ladies should be taught. Women today are encouraged to find their own way, to stay away from dependent relationships, to love whomever they want as long as they want, and if in the process they have to bear children, to farm their children out to someone else's care and influence. And don't worry about being sensible, modest, or pure, but do whatever pleases you in fulfilling your desires. That's not God's plan.